My name is Alexandra Reynolds, and I'm 34 years old. Standing at my father's funeral in a black dress that felt too tight around my chest, I could barely breathe through the grief. Dad had left me his prized $30 million penthouse condo in Manhattan. As mourners offered condolences, my husband Marcus leaned in, his breath hot against my ear. "I changed the lock on your new condo. If you don't like it, we can get a divorce." I burst out laughing because the condo isn't even in my name. Before I tell you how I turned my grief into the greatest revenge story, let me know where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button because this story of betrayal and justice is just getting started. Growing up as the only daughter of Richard Reynolds was like living in a golden bubble. My father built his real estate empire from nothing, transforming abandoned buildings in Manhattan into luxury properties through sheer determination and business savvy. Our family name adorned some of the most prestigious buildings in New York City. "Always know your worth, Alexandra," he'd tell me while pointing at the skyline from our living room window. These buildings aren't just concrete and glass. They're monuments to knowing when to take risks and when to protect what's yours. My mother, Eleanor, was the perfect counterpart to my father's ambition. She handled the social aspects of his business with grace and intelligence, hosting dinners that sealed million-dollar deals through carefully orchestrated conversations. I learned how to read people from her. The slight tightening around someone's eyes when they're hiding something, the way a genuine smile creates tiny wrinkles that can't be faked. When Mom died of breast cancer when I was 18, something in my father changed. He threw himself even deeper into his work, and I headed off to Princeton with the weight of being the sole heir to the Reynolds legacy. I excelled in business and finance, knowing I'd need these skills someday, but also developed a passion for art history that gave me something that was entirely my own. After college and an MBA from Wharton, I joined a prestigious art auction house, determined to make my own way rather than immediately stepping into my father's company. "Smart move," Dad had said over dinner at his favorite steakhouse. "Learn how other successful businesses operate before you take over mine." I was 29 when I met Marcus Wallace at a charity gala benefiting cancer research, a cause close to my heart because of Mom. He approached me during the silent auction, commenting intelligently on a painting I was admiring. "The artist captured loneliness in a room full of people," he said, standing just close enough to be intimate without being inappropriate. "Something tells me you understand that feeling." Marcus was handsome in that polished Wall Street way, perfectly tailored suit, confident smile, firm handshake. He was 35, a financial advisor with what seemed to be an impressive client list. After talking for hours that night, he asked for my number without once mentioning my family name or wealth, which was refreshing. Our romance moved quickly. Marcus was attentive, sending thoughtful gifts and remembering small details about my preferences. 6 months in, he suggested moving in together. At 8 months, he proposed with a 3-carat diamond ring at the top of the Empire State Building. I said yes without hesitation. The wedding was lavish. 400 guests at the Plaza Hotel, covered by Vogue. My father walked me down the aisle, squeezing my hand a little too tightly before placing it in Marcus's. "He's charming," Dad whispered when we danced at the reception. "Just remember, charm can be a mask. Keep your eyes open, sweetheart." I dismissed his concern as the protectiveness of a father who thought no man was good enough for his daughter. Marcus and I settled into married life in a spacious condo in Tribeca, purchased with my trust fund, but deliberately not as grand as what I could afford. I wanted us to feel like equals. The first sign something was off came when Marcus suggested I consolidate my accounts with his financial firm. "It's silly to have your money managed elsewhere when I'm an expert," he argued reasonably. When I hesitated, mentioning the contracts I had with my existing advisors, his face hardened momentarily before he smiled. "Of course, whatever makes you comfortable." Then came the subtle comments about my clothes, suggestions that certain outfits weren't appropriate for dinner with his clients. He began checking in multiple times when I was out with friends, his texts growing increasingly demanding if I didn't respond immediately. "Where are you? Call me back now. Who are you with? Send me a picture. Why aren't you answering? I'm coming to get you." I rationalized his behavior as protective rather than controlling. After growing up with a father who worked constantly, wasn't it nice to have someone who wanted to know where I was every minute? 6 months ago, Dad called me to his office in the Reynolds building. I knew something was wrong immediately. His assistant's eyes were red-rimmed, and Dad was staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows instead of at his computer screens. Pancreatic cancer, he said without preamble. Stage 4. The world tilted sideways. Dad was invincible. The man who negotiated billion-dollar deals and won, who played tennis 3 times a week at 65, who never showed weakness. How long? I managed to ask. 3 to 6 months. I've already set things in motion with Bernard, he said, referring to his lawyer of 30 years. Those final months were a blur of doctor appointments, experimental treatments, and long nights sitting beside Dad's bed in his penthouse condo, his pride and joy. A $30 million testament to his success, with views of Central Park that took your breath away. Marcus was surprisingly absent during this time. Someone has to keep earning, he'd say when I questioned why he couldn't come to a critical doctor's appointment. Besides, your father and I have never really gotten along. This was news to me. Dad had always been polite to Marcus, if not overly warm. 3 days before he died, Dad had a moment of startling clarity after days of morphine-induced confusion. Alexandra, he whispered, gripping my hand with surprising strength. Marcus isn't who you think. Bernard has everything you need. Trust Bernard, not Marcus. Before I could ask what he meant, he slipped back into sedated sleep. I told myself it was the medication talking. Dad died peacefully in his sleep 48 hours later. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just a shell that could somehow still move and speak. The morning of his funeral, I stood in front of the mirror in our Tribeca apartment, barely recognizing the pale woman in black staring back at me. Marcus fussed around me, checking his watch repeatedly. We need to go soon. The car will be waiting. Have you heard anything about the will yet? When is the reading? In my grief-stricken state, I barely registered the inappropriate timing of his questions. The funeral was held at my father's sprawling estate in the Hamptons, a property that had been in our family for 3 generations. White chairs lined the immaculate lawn overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. Dad's final request was to be remembered with the sound of waves in the background. The weather cooperated with clear blue skies, as if even nature respected Richard Reynolds enough to provide perfect conditions for his farewell. The who's who of New York society and business filled those seats. Mayors, both current and former, real estate tycoons who had been both competitors and allies to my father, celebrities who lived in Reynolds buildings, and distant family members who suddenly remembered their connection to us. I recognized some faces from board meetings I'd attended with Dad, others from charity events, and some I suspected were only there to confirm that the great Richard Reynolds was truly gone. Marcus had been acting strange all morning. While I got dressed, he'd made 3 phone calls in the hallway, his voice too low for me to hear the conversations. During the drive to the Hamptons, he kept checking his phone, typing furiously with a frown creasing his forehead. When I asked if everything was okay, he snapped, "Just work stuff. Focus on your father today." Now, as we stood in the receiving line before the service, I could feel his impatience in the way he shifted his weight from foot to foot, the way his hand at the small of my back would occasionally press too hard, urging me to speed up my conversations with mourners. Amelia Johnson, my father's executive assistant for 20 years, hugged me tightly. "He was so proud of you," she whispered. "Everything he did was for you." Before I could respond, Marcus cut in. "Thank you for coming, Amelia. Alexandra needs a moment before the service starts." He guided me away toward a quiet corner of the garden. I thought perhaps he was being considerate, giving me space to collect myself. Instead, he leaned in, adjusting his gold cufflinks, a wedding gift from me, and whispered those unbelievable words. "I changed the lock on the $30 million condo you inherited. If you don't like it, we can get a divorce." The shock of his statement, the audacity, the timing, the cold calculation, hit me like a physical blow. And then, completely involuntarily, I started to laugh. Not a small giggle, but full-bodied laughter that drew stares from nearby mourners. Marcus's face flushed red. "What's so funny?" I'm serious, Alexandra. I couldn't stop laughing. It was partly hysteria, partly relief, and partly genuine amusement at how thoroughly my husband had misunderstood the situation. Just yesterday, I'd had a private meeting with Bernard Goldstein, my father's lawyer and most trusted advisor. Your father was concerned about Marcus's intentions. Bernard had told me in the wood-paneled study of my father's Manhattan brownstone. Over the last year, he had Marcus investigated. Bernard slid a folder across the desk. Inside were credit reports showing massive gambling debts, photographs of Marcus meeting with known loan sharks, and records of attempts to take out loans using my trust fund as collateral. Attempts that had failed because my father had set up ironclad protections. The penthouse condo isn't in your name, Alexandra, Bernard explained. It's held in the Reynolds family trust, with you as the beneficiary, but not the outright owner. Marcus can't touch it, no matter what he tries. Now, as Marcus glared at me in the garden of my father's estate, I composed myself. We should take our seats. The service is about to begin. Is that all you have to say? He hissed, grabbing my elbow. I gently removed his hand. We'll discuss it after we honor my father. Throughout the service, the eulogies from business partners, the readings from Dad's favorite poems, the stories of his generosity that had me alternating between tears and smiles, I could feel Marcus seething beside me. His leg bounced nervously, his jaw clenched and unclenched, and his eyes kept darting around as if seeking an escape. When it was my turn to speak, I approached the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. My father taught me to recognize value, I began. Not just in buildings or investments, but in people. He showed me that true wealth isn't what you accumulate, but what you protect and who you share it with. I saw Marcus shift uncomfortably in his seat. After the service, as guests moved toward the reception in the main house, I made my way to Bernard, who was standing unobtrusively near a topiary garden. I need to speak with you, I said quietly. Dad's study, 15 minutes. Bernard nodded once, understanding in his eyes. I'll be there. As I turned to join the reception, I caught sight of Marcus watching me from across the lawn, his expression calculating. For the first time in our marriage, I saw him clearly, not as the charming, attentive man I'd fallen in love with, but as someone who had been playing a role. And now that my father was gone, he thought the performance could end. He had no idea that the final act was just beginning. The study in my father's Hamptons estate was his personal sanctuary. Unlike his Manhattan office with its sleek, modern design intended to impress clients, this room reflected his true personality. Leather-bound books lined the walls, many of them first editions collected over decades. The massive mahogany desk had belonged to my grandfather, and the worn leather chair behind it still held the indentation of my father's frame. I settled into one of the visitor chairs as Bernard entered, closing the heavy door behind him. He carried a leather portfolio and wore the grave expression of someone about to deliver complicated news. Your husband is making assumptions about your inheritance, Bernard began, removing his glasses and polishing them with a handkerchief. Dangerous assumptions. He thinks the condo is mine outright, I confirmed. Bernard nodded. Richard anticipated this. Your father was an extraordinarily careful man, especially when it came to protecting you. He opened the portfolio and spread several documents on the desk. The penthouse condo, like most of your father's significant assets, is held in the Reynolds family trust. You are the primary beneficiary, yes, but with specific conditions and protections. Bernard pointed to highlighted sections of a complex legal document. You have full right of occupancy and use. You control who enters and who doesn't. But the trust itself remains the owner, with a board of trustees that includes myself, your father's oldest friend Judge William Montgomery, and your cousin Patricia, who is a forensic accountant. So Marcus can't sell it or borrow against it, I clarified. He can't even step foot inside without your permission, Bernard confirmed. Your father was explicit about that provision. The door burst open, causing both of us to jump. Marcus stood in the doorway, his normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled, his face flushed with either alcohol or anger, possibly both. What's going on in here? He demanded, striding into the room like he owned it. Secret meetings on the day we bury your father? Really, Alexandra? Bernard calmly gathered the documents, sliding them back into his portfolio. Mr. Wallace, we're discussing private family matters. I am family, Marcus snapped. I'm her husband. Yes, for 4 years, Bernard acknowledged with professional politeness that barely masked his distaste. Richard Reynolds built his legacy over 40 years. The structures he put in place to protect that legacy are extensive and specific. Marcus turned to me. What's he talking about? What structures? I maintained the composed exterior my mother had taught me was essential in difficult situations. The will is complex, Marcus. Not everything comes to me directly. But the condo is part of a trust, Bernard interjected. Ms. Reynolds has rights as beneficiary, but the trust maintains ownership. Marcus's face contorted with barely contained rage. That's ridiculous. She's his only child. Everything should go to her, which means. It does not mean what you think it means, Bernard cut in, his voice hardening. And I should inform you that changing locks on property you don't own could potentially constitute criminal trespass. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. He turned to me. You told him about that? I met his gaze steadily. I didn't have to. Bernard cleared his throat. Mr. Wallace, there's another matter we need to discuss. The trust has been monitoring some concerning financial activities. From his portfolio, Bernard produced another document. These are records of attempts to secure loans using Alexandra's future inheritance as collateral. Loans from institutions with questionable reputations. The blood drained from Marcus's face. That's private financial business. It became the trust's business when you forged Alexandra's signature on the applications, Bernard replied calmly. That's fraud, Mr. Wallace. I felt like I was watching the scene from outside my body. The husband I thought I knew, the man I had trusted and loved, seemed to transform before my eyes into someone unrecognizable. His handsome features twisted with a combination of fear and calculation. Alexandra, Marcus said, his tone suddenly gentle as he approached me. You know I've only ever wanted what's best for us. For our future. These are just misunderstandings that we can clear up together. The sudden shift in his demeanor was jarring and illuminating. This was how he operated, charm when it served him, intimidation when it didn't. I think we should continue this discussion another time, I said evenly. Today is about honoring my father. Of course, Marcus agreed too quickly. Family first. Always. The irony of him invoking family values wasn't lost on me. As he left the study, his shoulders rigid with suppressed anger, Bernard waited until the door closed before speaking again. There's more you need to know, he said gravely. Your father hired private investigators last year. What they found about Marcus's background and current activities, it's concerning. Tell me everything, I requested, bracing myself. For the next hour, Bernard walked me through the evidence my father had accumulated. Marcus had gambling debts exceeding $2 million. He had been meeting with loan sharks known for violent collection methods. There were unexplained withdrawals from our joint accounts, money I had contributed that was now missing. Why didn't Dad tell me? I asked, feeling a mixture of gratitude for my father's foresight and hurt that he hadn't trusted me with this information sooner. Bernard's expression softened. He was gathering evidence to present to you in a way you couldn't dismiss. He knew you loved Marcus, and he respected your independence enough not to interfere without indisputable proof. I nodded, remembering my father's cryptic warning on his deathbed. Trust Bernard, not Marcus. What do I do now? I asked. That depends on what you want, Bernard replied. If you want to end the marriage, we can begin proceedings immediately with significant financial protections in place. If you want more information first, we continue the investigation. I thought about the years with Marcus, the whirlwind romance, the seemingly perfect marriage, and now the devastating betrayal. I thought about my father, who had seen through Marcus's facade when I couldn't or wouldn't. I want to know everything, I decided. Before I make any moves, I need the complete picture. Bernard nodded approvingly. Your father would expect nothing less. There's a detailed file waiting for you in the Manhattan office safe. Only you have the combination. As I stood to leave, Bernard added, Alexandra, be careful. Men like Marcus become desperate when their plans fall apart. And desperate men are dangerous. I straightened my shoulders, feeling a cold resolve replace the numbness of grief. I'm Richard Reynolds' daughter. I can handle dangerous men. 3 days after the funeral, I returned to the Tribeca apartment I shared with Marcus. He had been staying at a hotel, claiming I needed space to grieve, though I suspected he was actually giving me time to calm down, hoping I'd be more pliable when we next spoke about the inheritance. As I turned my key in the lock, I heard frantic movement inside. Pushing the door open slowly, I caught Marcus in our home office, hurriedly closing drawers and shoving papers into his briefcase. "Oh, you're back," he said, his surprise poorly masked by a forced smile. "I was just organizing some financial documents. For taxes." It was April, and we'd filed our taxes in February. "Find anything interesting?" I asked casually, setting down my purse. "Just boring paperwork," he replied too quickly. "How are you feeling?" "Better." I noticed his eyes dart to the built-in bookshelf where we kept important documents. Following his gaze, I saw several folders had been pulled out and hastily replaced. The tabs weren't aligned as they normally would be. "I'm doing okay," I answered, maintaining the vulnerable widow facade. "Bernard mentioned something about accessing the condo next week." Marcus immediately perked up. "That's great news. Did he give you the keys? Or should I go with you?" "He's meeting me there on Monday," I lied smoothly. Something about the trust allowing a transition period. "I should come," Marcus insisted, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "To support you." "That would be nice," I agreed, while mentally noting his eagerness. After he left for a business dinner that evening, I carefully examined the folders he'd been searching through. Our marriage certificate was missing, as were copies of my trust fund statements. I took photos of the disturbed files in office, then sent them to the private investigator Bernard had recommended, Samantha Reeves, a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes. The next morning, I met Samantha at a small coffee shop in Brooklyn, far from anywhere Marcus might run into us. "Your husband has a gambling problem," she confirmed, sliding photographs across the table. They showed Marcus entering high-stakes poker games at underground clubs, emerging looking either elated or devastated. "The timeline matches the withdrawals from your joint accounts," she continued, presenting a spreadsheet of transactions. "Nearly $800,000 over the past year, all on days he visited these gambling establishments." I felt sick. That was money I'd earned through my work at the auction house, not funds from my family. "There's more," Samantha said gently. "He hasn't been faithful." More photographs appeared. Marcus entering hotel rooms with different women, none of them looking like professional colleagues. The blonde is Jennifer Carson, marketing executive. The brunette is Sophia Williams, pharmaceutical sales. The redhead. "I get the picture," I interrupted, literally pushing the photos away. "There's a pattern," Samantha explained. "These women all have something in common besides your husband." "They're all wealthy," I guessed. She nodded. "From prominent families. Before you, he dated Lucia Rossi, Italian textile heiress. He was engaged to Catherine Pierce, shipping fortune. He has a type, Ms. Reynolds. And it's not about love." I remembered how Marcus had pursued me, how he'd seemed to genuinely appreciate my knowledge of art rather than just my name or bank account. Had that all been calculated? I need more, I decided. Concrete evidence of financial fraud. 2 days later, I had lunch with my father's oldest business partner, Elliot Carter. After reminiscing about Dad, I carefully brought up Marcus. "Did my husband ever approach you about business opportunities?" I asked. Elliot's hesitation told me everything before he even spoke. "He did, actually. About 4 months ago. He wanted investors for a real estate development in Miami. Said he had inside access to permits through your family connections. Did you invest?" "No," Elliot said firmly. "I checked with Richard first. He knew nothing about it. When I declined, Marcus tried to borrow against your future inheritance instead." "He what?" Though I was prepared for this, hearing it confirmed still shocked me. "He implied you'd be receiving property worth at least $50 million after Richard's passing and offered 15% returns for bridge financing until then." I thanked Elliot for his honesty and asked him to document what he'd told me. Next, I visited First Manhattan Bank, where Marcus and I had joint accounts. I requested a meeting with the manager, Harold Fletcher. "Mrs. Wallace," he greeted me warmly. "My condolences about your father." "Thank you, Harold. I need to review some transactions." His smile faltered slightly. "Of course. Which accounts?" "All of them. And I'd like to see the signature cards as well." Harold returned with a thick folder and a worried expression. As we reviewed the transactions, I identified several transfers I hadn't authorized, money moved from my personal accounts to our joint accounts, then withdrawn in large cash amounts. "This isn't my signature," I said, pointing to the authorization forms. The handwriting resembled mine, but had subtle differences in the loops and pressure points. Harold grew pale. "Mrs. Wallace, It's Ms. Reynolds," I corrected him. "And I'll need copies of all these documents for my lawyer." That evening, Marcus returned home earlier than usual, bringing an expensive bottle of wine and takeout from my favorite restaurant. "I thought we could have a quiet night in," he suggested, his voice gentle. "We haven't really talked since the funeral. About us. About the future." I played along, sipping the wine and listening as he outlined grand plans for our future. Traveling the world, perhaps starting a family, renovating the penthouse condo. He carefully avoided mentioning where the money for these adventures would come from. "I miss your father too," he said, reaching for my hand across the table. I know we had our differences, but I respected him. The lie was so blatant I had to take another sip of wine to avoid calling him out. "Bernard mentioned some concerns about financial matters," I said carefully. "Something about loans?" Marcus's expression hardened momentarily before he forced a laugh. "Just a misunderstanding. I was exploring investment opportunities for us. Bernard is very old school. He doesn't understand modern finance." "So you didn't forge my signature on loan applications?" I asked directly. His composure slipped. "Who told you that?" "It's completely false. Alexandra, you can't believe everything Bernard says. He's trying to control your inheritance, keep you dependent on the trust." The gaslighting was so obvious now that I knew what to look for. How had I missed it for 4 years? "I think I'm going to stay with Patricia for a few days," I said, referring to my cousin. "I need space to process everything." "That's not necessary," Marcus said quickly, his tone sharpening. "We should stay together right now. People will talk if we're separated so soon after Richard's death." "I don't care what people talk about. Your father wouldn't want you making hasty decisions about our marriage while you're grieving," he insisted. The manipulation was textbook. Invoking my dead father while isolating me from family who might see through his act. "Patricia already expects me," I lied, standing up. "I'll pack a bag." Marcus followed me to the bedroom, his charm evaporating. "This is ridiculous. You're not thinking clearly. You need me right now." What I needed was evidence, time, and distance. As I packed, I sent a prearranged text to Samantha, a single word: leaving. 10 minutes later, my phone rang. It was Bernard. "Alexandra, we need you at the office immediately," he said when I answered. "There's an urgent issue with one of your father's properties." Marcus hovered nearby, listening. "I'll be right there," I replied, hanging up. "I have to go. Trust business." "I'll drive you," Marcus offered too quickly. "Bernard is sending a car," I countered. "It's already downstairs." His jaw tightened, but he couldn't object without seeming controlling. "Call me when you're done. We need to finish our conversation." Downstairs, Samantha waited in an unmarked sedan. "Did you get the recording?" she asked as we pulled away. I nodded, retrieving the small device I'd hidden under the dining table. "Everything from dinner, including his denial about the forgery." "Perfect," Samantha said. "Now we move to phase 2. The official reading took place in Bernard's office 1 week after the funeral. The space epitomized old money, oriental rugs over hardwood floors, oil paintings of stern-looking judges on the walls, and furniture that had probably been there since the firm was founded in the 1950s. Marcus sat beside me, attempting to project supportive husband energy while practically vibrating with anticipation. Several of my father's closest friends were present, along with my cousin Patricia. Bernard began by outlining the basic structure of the estate. The majority of Richard Reynolds' assets are contained within the Reynolds family trust, established 20 years ago and modified periodically, most recently 6 months ago. Marcus shifted in his seat at the mention of the recent modification. The trust holds ownership of 17 commercial properties, 12 residential buildings, the Hamptons Estate, the Manhattan Brownstone, and the Central Park Penthouse condominium. Bernard looked directly at Marcus. To be absolutely clear, these properties are owned by the trust, not by any individual. Marcus's knuckles whitened as he gripped the armrests of his chair. Alexandra Reynolds is the primary beneficiary of the trust, with full rights of use and occupancy for the residential properties, and voting control over business decisions related to the commercial holdings. So she controls everything, Marcus interrupted. She can sell properties if she wants, take out loans against them, whatever. Bernard's expression remained neutral. Ms. Reynolds has management authority within parameters established by the trust. Major transactions require approval from the trustee board. That's ridiculous, Marcus snapped. She's his only child. Why all these restrictions? The restrictions aren't on Alexandra, Bernard clarified. They're on anyone who might attempt to access the assets through her. His gaze bore into Marcus. Including spouses. The implication hung heavy in the air. Bernard continued, additionally, there is a personal bequest. Richard maintained a private safe in his Manhattan office. Alexandra, he left you the combination. He handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a card with a series of numbers, my birth date, my mother's birth date, and the date my parents met, arranged in a specific sequence. The safe contains personal items Richard wanted you to have immediately, outside the trust structure, Bernard explained. That afternoon, I visited my father's Manhattan office alone, having convinced Marcus I needed private time with my father's personal effects. The Reynolds building stood 40 stories over Park Avenue, its distinctive Art Deco facade instantly recognizable in the skyline. My father's corner office remained exactly as he had left it, down to the half-empty coffee mug on his desk. I moved to the painting behind his desk, a Monet water lilies that my mother had loved, and swung it aside to reveal the wall safe. My hands trembled slightly as I entered the combination. The heavy door swung open to reveal several items, a velvet jewelry box containing my mother's sapphire necklace, legal documents, and a leather-bound journal. I opened the journal first. It contained my father's private thoughts, written in his bold handwriting. I flipped to entries from the past year and began to read. Met with Bernard about Alexandra today. The investigators' reports on Marcus are concerning. Gambling debts, unauthorized loans, possible previous identities. Need more concrete evidence before approaching Alexandra. She loves him, will need indisputable proof. Another entry, dated 3 months ago, Marcus approached Elliot about investment opportunity, using my name and connections without permission. Elliot declined, but how many others has he contacted? Accelerating trust modifications with Bernard. The most recent entry, just weeks before his death. Alexandra needs to see Marcus for who he truly is, but I may not have time to show her. Bernard will help. The safe contains everything she'll need. I've taught her well. She's stronger than she knows. She'll make the right decisions when the time comes. Tears blurred my vision. Even in his final days, my father had been protecting me, preparing for a future he wouldn't see. Beneath the journal was a USB drive labeled MW Evidence and a folder containing what appeared to be results of a thorough background investigation into Marcus Wallace, or rather, Martin Whitmore, his apparent real name. According to these documents, Marcus had changed his identity 7 years ago after being implicated in a financial scam in Boston. Before that, he was Michael Wilson, who disappeared from Philadelphia just as investors were discovering their money had vanished. The pattern was clear: charm wealthy women, marry into money, drain accounts, disappear, repeat with a new identity. I sat in my father's chair, holding the evidence of my husband's true nature, and felt a strange calm settle over me. The grief and shock were still there, but now accompanied by something else, a cold, clear determination that felt like my father's final gift. That evening, Marcus suggested dinner at our favorite restaurant. To celebrate your inheritance, he said, as if the will reading had gone exactly as he'd hoped. I agreed, curious to see how he would adjust his approach. Over expensive wine and steaks, he was the Marcus I'd fallen in love with, attentive, charming, seemingly genuine in his concern for my well-being. I've been thinking, he said, reaching for my hand across the table. We should take some time away. Maybe Paris? You've always loved the galleries there. We could stay at that little boutique hotel in Saint-Germain. That sounds lovely, I replied. But what about your work? Your clients? He waved dismissively. They can wait. You're my priority now. And how would we pay for this trip? I asked innocently. The trust hasn't distributed any funds yet. His smile flickered momentarily. We have savings. The savings from our joint account? The one that's nearly empty now. Marcus's expression hardened. What are you talking about? The $800,000 that disappeared over the past year, I clarified. Usually in five-figure withdrawals the morning after you visited underground poker games. The color drained from his face. You've been checking my spending? No, your gambling losses. There's a difference. His charm vanished, replaced by cold calculation. You're upset about your father. You're not thinking clearly. Actually, I'm thinking more clearly than I have in 4 years, I countered. Martin. The name hit him like a physical blow. He glanced around the restaurant, checking if anyone had heard. I don't know what you think you've discovered, but you're mistaken, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Am I mistaken about the loan applications with my forged signature? Or about Jennifer, Sophia, and the others? Or perhaps about your engagement to Catherine Pierce while you were dating me? Each revelation landed like a slap. Marcus, or whoever he was, struggled to maintain his composure. Alexandra, let's discuss this at home, he insisted. I'm not going anywhere private with you, I replied calmly. Not now that I know who you really are. His expression darkened. You have no idea what I'm capable of. Actually, I do. That's precisely the problem. I stood to leave. Marcus grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. You think you've won because of your father's precious trust? He hissed. There are ways around trusts. Accidents happen. Mental health episodes require conservatorship. The threat was unmistakable. I pulled my arm free. This marriage is over, I stated firmly. My lawyer will be in touch. As I walked away, I felt his eyes boring into my back. I knew this confrontation had escalated the situation from deception to potential danger. Marcus had just lost his meal ticket for years of careful manipulation undone in one dinner. He wouldn't accept defeat easily. When I returned to our apartment, I wasn't surprised to find Marcus had beaten me there. He stood in the living room, visibly furious. You think you're so clever, he sneered. Richard's perfect little princess, too smart to be conned. Yet here we are, I replied, keeping the kitchen island between us. You have no proof of anything, he insisted. It's your word against mine. I smiled then, the kind of smile my father used to give opponents across negotiating tables when he held all the cards. That would be true, I agreed, if my father hadn't hired private investigators last year. If the trust hadn't documented every loan application you forged. If we weren't recording this conversation right now. His eyes widened, scanning the room for devices. You bitch, he snarled, advancing toward me. I pressed a button on my phone. Security to Penthouse B, emergency situation. Within 30 seconds, 2 large men in suits entered from the service elevator. Security personnel Bernard had arranged to monitor the building. Ms. Reynolds, is everything all right? The taller one asked. No, I replied calmly. My husband was just leaving. Permanently. You can't do this, Marcus protested. This is my home too. Actually, the apartment lease is solely in my name, I informed him. Bernard confirmed it this morning. Marcus looked for me to the security guards, calculating his options and finding none. This isn't over, he threatened as the guards escorted him to the door. Yes, it is, I contradicted him. You just don't know it yet. The morning after Marcus was removed from our apartment, I had the locks changed, a small but symbolic act of reclaiming my space. Bernard had already filed for an emergency restraining order based on Marcus's threats and temporary orders freezing our joint assets to prevent him from draining accounts. Marcus created a scene in the building lobby, shouting accusations until security escorted him to the street. He called incessantly until I blocked his number, then began using different phones to reach me. The private investigator, Samantha, continued building our case. Through meticulous research, she discovered a storage unit in Queens registered under the name Martin Whitmore. "We need a court order to access it legally," she advised during our meeting at Bernard's office. "How long will that take?" I asked. "Given the evidence of financial fraud we already have, we could have it by tomorrow," Bernard replied. "Judge Montgomery owes your father several favors." The storage unit proved to be a treasure trove of evidence. It contained multiple passports with different names, but Marcus's photograph, financial records from previous scams, and most disturbingly, detailed research on wealthy women, including me. A folder labeled Alexandra Reynolds contained newspaper clippings about my family, photographs of me at social events dating back to before we met, and notes about my habits, preferences, and vulnerabilities. "He studied you," Samantha observed grimly. "This wasn't opportunistic. He targeted you specifically." Also in the storage unit were mementos from previous relationships, photographs, jewelry, handwritten letters from women who clearly believed they were in loving relationships. One name stood out: Rachel Winters, a Boston socialite who had dated Martin Whitmore 6 years ago. I insisted on meeting her. Samantha located her in Connecticut, where she had retreated after what she described as a devastating betrayal. Rachel agreed to see me, and 2 days later I sat in her sunlit garden, comparing stories with a woman who had walked the path I was currently on. "He was so attentive at first," Rachel recalled, her fingers nervously twisting the stem of her teacup. "Like he could read my mind, anticipate exactly what I wanted before I knew I wanted it." I nodded, recognizing the pattern. "Then came the financial emergencies," she continued. "Always plausible, always temporary. He just needed to borrow against my trust until this deal closed or that investment paid out. By the time I realized none of those opportunities were real, he'd taken nearly $2 million. "Did you press charges?" I asked. She shook her head. "He disappeared. Changed his name, his appearance. The police said it would be nearly impossible to find him, and even harder to prove criminal intent rather than just bad investment decisions. Besides, I was too embarrassed to pursue it publicly." "But you'd testify now?" I pressed. If it meant stopping him from doing this to someone else. Rachel's expression hardened. "In a heartbeat." With Rachel's statement added to our growing evidence, Bernard coordinated with the district attorney's office to build a criminal case against Marcus for fraud, identity theft, and forgery. Given his pattern of disappearing when exposed, we also obtained court orders freezing any assets we could identify in his various names. Meanwhile, Marcus grew increasingly desperate. He approached mutual friends with wild stories about my mental state, claiming grief had made me paranoid and irrational. When that failed to gain traction, he threatened to release damaging information about me to the press. What could he possibly have? I asked Bernard when he relayed this threat. "Nothing legitimate," Bernard assured me. "But he could fabricate things. Are you prepared for that possibility?" I thought about what Marcus knew about me. My insecurities, private moments, things shared in confidence during our marriage. I won't be blackmailed, I decided. Whatever he thinks he has, let him try to use it. A restraining order didn't deter Marcus for long. 2 weeks after our separation, security cameras caught him attempting to enter my building through the service entrance, wearing a delivery uniform. When confronted, he fled, but the violation of the restraining order strengthened our legal position. The district attorney formally charged Marcus with multiple counts of fraud, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. Rather than waiting for police to find him, Marcus surrendered himself, calculating that cooperation might improve his position. His bail hearing revealed just how extensive his deception had been. The prosecution presented evidence of at least 3 previous identities and estimated financial fraud exceeding $5 million across multiple victims. Despite his lawyer's arguments about community ties, all fabricated, the judge set bail at $3 million. Unable to raise that amount with his assets frozen, Marcus remained in custody. While the criminal case proceeded, I turned my attention to my father's business empire. Though I'd always known I would eventually take over Reynolds Properties, I had expected years of mentorship from my father during the transition. Now I was thrust into leadership with minimal preparation. The company's board of directors, mostly older men who had worked with my father for decades, viewed me with poorly disguised skepticism. Alexandra is still grieving. I overheard Walter Briggs, the CFO, tell another board member before my first meeting. We should maintain operational control until she's ready. If she's ever ready. Walking into that boardroom, I felt the weight of doubt and preconceptions. I wore one of my father's watches, too big for my wrist, but a talisman of his presence, and carried the leather portfolio he'd used for important meetings. Gentlemen, I began, taking my place at the head of the table. I appreciate your loyalty to my father and this company. I know many of you have concerns about my leadership. That's understandable. But make no mistake, Reynolds Properties is my legacy, and I intend to honor my father by making it even stronger. I proceeded to demonstrate detailed knowledge of current projects, market conditions, and the company's financial position, information I'd absorbed during long nights studying the materials in my father's safe. By the meeting's end, the skepticism hadn't vanished but had been tempered with reluctant respect. As weeks passed, I discovered something surprising. My father had been preparing me for leadership all along. Projects he'd insisted I accompany him on, seemingly casual conversations about market strategy, introductions to key industry figures. All had been carefully orchestrated mentorship disguised as father-daughter activities. The more I settled into my role at Reynolds Properties, the more I found evidence of my father's foresight. He had left detailed notes on pending deals, assessments of various executives' strengths and weaknesses, and strategies for potential market shifts. When a crisis erupted over permit issues with a major development in Brooklyn, I handled it with a confidence that surprised even me, negotiating with city officials using approaches I'd observed my father employ countless times. Richard would be proud, Walter told me after that successful resolution. Coming from him, it was the highest praise possible. Meanwhile, Marcus made one final desperate move from behind bars. Through his lawyer, he offered a deal. If I dropped the charges and paid him a settlement of $5 million, he would provide evidence about irregularities in Reynolds Properties that would otherwise become public during his trial. It was a clumsy attempt at blackmail, suggesting he had documentation of illegal business practices by my father. Bernard and I recognized it immediately as a bluff. My father was aggressive in business, but scrupulously ethical. Every transaction, every permit, every contract had been obtained legitimately. Instead of responding to the threat, I authorized our legal team to forward all evidence of Marcus's crimes to prosecutors in Boston and Philadelphia, where his previous victims lived. Within days, additional charges were filed against him in those jurisdictions, effectively destroying any leverage he thought he had. When news of the additional charges broke, several more women came forward with similar stories of manipulation and financial exploitation. What had begun as my personal nightmare was revealing itself as a years-long pattern of predatory behavior that had affected dozens of lives. The Marcus Wallace I had married had never existed. He was a carefully constructed fiction designed to access wealth through calculated deception. The realization was both painful and liberating. I hadn't failed at choosing a partner. I had been targeted by a skilled con artist who had fooled many intelligent, successful women before me. When Marcus realized his blackmail attempt had backfired spectacularly, he made one last desperate move. He offered to plead guilty to reduced charges in exchange for his cooperation in identifying other financial criminals he had worked with over the years. The prosecutor consulted me about the plea deal. He'd serve at least 7 years, she explained. With the additional charges from other states, he could be looking at over 15 years total. Is that acceptable to you, or do you want us to proceed to trial? I considered the question carefully. A trial would mean publicity, having to testify about the humiliating details of how thoroughly I had been deceived. It would mean reliving the betrayal again and again. Take the plea, I decided. Justice doesn't require public spectacle. It requires consequences for actions. 7 years plus whatever the other jurisdictions add seems consequential enough. Marcus Wallace, or whatever his real name might be, would have years in prison to contemplate the collapse of his carefully constructed house of cards. And I would have those same years to rebuild my life on foundations of truth rather than deception. 1 year after my father's funeral, I stood beside his grave in the private cemetery overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. The polished granite headstone was simple by Reynolds standards. My father had always valued substance over flash, a lesson I appreciated more with each passing day. I placed white roses, his favorite, against the stone and brushed away fallen leaves. "You were right about him," I said aloud. "About everything, really." In the months since Marcus's guilty plea and sentencing, I had undergone my own transformation. Weekly therapy sessions helped me process not only the betrayal, but also the unresolved grief over losing my father just as I was beginning to know him as an adult. The interesting thing about trust, my therapist Dr. Klein had observed, is that once broken, it never repairs the same way. The cracks remain visible. But sometimes, those visible repairs make the whole stronger and more beautiful for having survived damage. I had taken those words to heart, examining each relationship in my life with new awareness. Some friendships had fallen away, particularly those who had sided with Marcus or questioned my version of events. Others had deepened through the crisis, revealing genuine loyalty I hadn't fully appreciated before. Reynolds Properties was thriving under my leadership. After the initial skepticism, the board had come to respect my business instincts, a blend of my father's strategic thinking and my own more collaborative approach. We had launched a major urban renewal project in Brooklyn, transforming abandoned warehouses into mixed-income housing with green spaces and community facilities. To honor my father's memory, I established the Richard Reynolds Foundation, focused on 2 areas he had cared about deeply: cancer research and affordable housing initiatives. The foundation quickly became known for its hands-on approach, with stringent accountability measures that reflected my father's belief that good intentions required good execution to matter. Personally, I had reclaimed spaces and experiences that had been tainted by Marcus's presence. I moved permanently into my father's penthouse condo, redecorating it to blend his classic taste with elements that reflected my own aesthetic. The $30 million property now truly felt like home, a sanctuary with views that still took my breath away every morning. I sold the Tribeca apartment where Marcus and I had lived, donating his abandoned possessions to a shelter for victims of domestic abuse. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Financial abuse might not leave visible bruises, but the damage to one's sense of security and self-worth was just as real. As the criminal case concluded, Bernard had discovered one final gift from my father. A letter stored with the will, to be delivered after all legal matters were resolved. "Alexandra," my father had written in his bold handwriting. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've discovered the truth about Marcus. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from this pain, but I'm not sorry you found your strength through it. You are resilient in ways your mother, and I always knew you would be. Trust that resilience. The world will test it again and again, but it won't break you. It will only reveal how extraordinary you truly are. I've arranged my affairs to protect what I've built, but the true inheritance I leave you isn't measured in property or dollars. It's the knowledge that you are your own best advocate, your own most reliable partner. I love you beyond words. Dad." I had cried for hours after reading those words, feeling both the acute loss of his presence and the enduring gift of his wisdom. Now, standing at his grave on the anniversary of his death, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me throughout the tumultuous year. "I changed the locks myself," I told him with a small smile. "On all the properties." Seems fitting, doesn't it? The wind rustled through nearby trees, and I could almost hear his approving chuckle. Life continued to evolve in unexpected ways. I had reconnected with an old college friend, David, whose genuine interest in my work and thoughtful perspective was refreshing after Marcus's calculated charm. Whether our renewed friendship would develop into something more remained to be seen. I was in no rush to trust completely again. What I knew with certainty was that I would never again ignore my instincts or dismiss warning signs in relationships. The painful lessons of the past year had refined my judgment rather than making me bitter. Another gift from my father, who had always viewed challenges as opportunities for growth rather than excuses for retreat. As I turned to leave the cemetery, I noticed a red-tailed hawk circling overhead, my father's favorite bird, a creature he had admired for its sharp vision and patient hunting strategy. "See everything, move when the time is right," he used to say while watching them from his office window. I smiled at the coincidence, or perhaps the sign, and walked back to my car with renewed purpose. The journey from grief to strength wasn't a straight line, but a winding path with setbacks and unexpected turns. Yet each step forward, however small, was progress worth celebrating. Have you ever experienced that moment when you suddenly see someone's true character? That instant when the mask slips and you realize you've been looking at a carefully crafted illusion? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this tale of betrayal and redemption resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button and share this video with someone who might need to hear that even our darkest moments can lead to unexpected strength. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember that sometimes the locks that need changing aren't just on your doors, but on your heart, not to keep love out, but to ensure that only the worthy gain entry.